Hello, everyone. My name is Casey Conlon. I'm the Library Sustainability Coordinator for the Mid-Hudson Library System, and I want to welcome you to our Trustee Essentials webinar. If you need any help today, you can feel free to contact me via the chat box. I can try to help you with any technical issues that you're having. We're going to try to keep everybody muted for this session just to cut down on any kind of noise and to make a smooth experience for everybody. Rebecca will be presenting in a moment. If you have any questions as we proceed through the webinar, you can feel free to use the question box at the right to add those questions, or wherever it is on your screen. It might be in a pull down if you're using a mobile device. There is also a chat option that you can use for questions as well. So anyway, welcome very much. Welcome to the webinar today. And Rebecca, you're on.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Casey. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Rebecca Smith-Aldridge. I'm the Executive Director of the Mid-Hudson Library System, and we thank you for joining us tonight to learn more about your role as a trustee at your local public library. This is actually our first time doing this webinar online. Usually we do these workshops in person at our headquarters in Poughkeepsie or out in the field in the 5 counties that we serve. So you are experiencing this for the first time along with us. Thank you very much, COVID. So we've modified a few things, but we hope to still make sure you get all of your questions answered that you may have come here with this evening. We will pause after each section for questions, and Casey will help facilitate those for us along the way. You also should have received a handout packet before we came online today. And if you didn't, Casey's gonna pop a link to the online version of that into the chat box. You can just click it and have access to it. So we make sure everyone has that. We will refer to it here and there throughout the night, and the slides are annotated with which slides go to which handout. So we'd just like you to have that reference for you after you leave the workshop today. Hopefully it'll help you cut down on how many notes you have to take tonight if there's things you want to capture that we talk about. So normally when we do this workshop, as I said, we're in a room together and we get to know you better, and you get to know us better. And that's obviously a little different this time around as we're all online. But we did want you to have a chance to see who else is online with you today, because one of the cool things about being part of the Mid-Hudson Library System is that there's over 600 library trustees in this region. People just like yourselves who want to help out in their community and are choosing to do so by volunteering at their library. So we'd like to ask everyone for your first interaction with the software here tonight to use the chat box and share your name, your library, and how long you've served on the board. And don't be shy. If you just joined the board, that's exactly why you're here tonight. We've had people who have been on the board for 20 years come to the Trustee Essentials workshop and still learn things they didn't know. We've had people come on to this workshop who have not yet chosen to be on the board. They want to see what it's all about, and they still choose to join the board, which we always think is a good sign that the workshop is a good use of their time and gives them a good sense of what the role is for a public library trustee. So again, feel free to pop this information into the chat box so we can see kind of the span of experience that we have here on the call here tonight. Usually we've got people who have been on the board, like I said, from before they actually got on it. Maybe you've been on for a month or two, sometimes you've been on for a year or two. So we know we have people of all lengths of tenure on their board so far tonight. And we think we'll probably have something for everyone, or at least answer some questions that you've had since you started serving on the board. What we're going to do tonight is focus on 3 areas. And after each of these sections, we'll pause for questions, but we want to give you the lay of the land basically in this first section, the library network in New York State, and just kind of help decode for you where your library sits in the state infrastructure of educational institutions. And that is kind of a mysterious thing. I've worked at Mid-Hudson for about 21 years, and no joke, I felt like it took me the first 10 to figure this part out. So I'm going to save you a lot of time. Then we're going to go into talking about your roles and responsibilities, kind of like where the rubber hits the road, the day-to-day stuff that you help out with and you advise on, and where your legal responsibilities lie. This isn't necessarily the simplest volunteer job that you'll ever have, but it's certainly a very rewarding volunteer job that you've chosen. But there are some laws that you need to be aware of to make sure you're following them to protect the reputation of your library. So we'll give you a fighting chance to understand those. And then we're going to just go over the basics of board meetings, just to give you a primer on open meetings law and cover a couple of best practices that help you get off to a great start as a new public library trustee, particularly if you've never served on a public board before. I think this will give you a sense that you understand the parameters within which you're working, which should help boost your confidence and make you more comfortable in the work that you're doing for your community. So normally when we're in the room together, we hand out the Handbook for Library Trustees of New York State. It's a little thank you for coming tonight. We give you a free copy. This is a publication that's freely available online. You can access it tonight if you wanted to. Maybe you already have. But if you'd like your very own print copy, because we know a lot of library people like print still, you can email this workshop code to our business office, JKAY, at midhudson.org using the code TE92020, which is 9/2020, and they'll send you a handbook, a print handbook, right to your library with your name on it so that you can pick it up the next time you're at the library. So we're going to refer to this handbook quite a bit. You should probably consider it to be your guide at the side while you're on the board. It's written with the idea that it needs to be just very basic, just cover the essentials of what you need to know to be effective and help your library be successful. And it's something that I think has proven the test of time. This is the 5th edition of it. We actually have started updating it even more frequently than we have in the past because laws have been changing so much recently. But it's a great place to get basic information and as a good reference tool for you, particularly for some of the stuff we're going to talk about tonight. So let's jump right into the library network in New York State because it's a lot of fun. And if you've got your packet with you, either printed out or on your screen, we're going to be looking at the very first page in that packet, which is a super exciting flow chart. I know this is not the most exciting way to kick off the webinar, but I think it's important to point out that your library is part of the state education department. And anyone familiar with the state budget and how New York State operates knows that is an enormous department. It really is the largest section of the state budget. It's an incredibly important part of what happens in our state and what we all invest our taxes in New York State. But you can see that there is a lot of levels of bureaucracy that are between your library and really the ultimate authority over libraries, which is the Board of Regents, which is an appointed board appointed by the New York State Assembly that oversees all educational institutions in New York State, including libraries. So your library is not like a regular nonprofit. You are what's called a not-for-profit education corporation. And that comes with some, I think, important ties to responsibilities and legal issues and really stature in the community that needs to be respected by those that you serve and those that fund you and make decisions that influence your library. So that's what we'd like to cover here this evening. But a couple things I wanted to point out on the flow chart for you. Of course, you got the Board of Regents at the top, and I mentioned them being the ultimate authority over libraries, which does mean that if you ran afoul of law and regulation, let's just say regulation for now, they would have the authority to remove a trustee from your board. And they actually have removed whole boards who weren't cooperating with regulations and doing the best by their community. So when people say, you know, who really oversees libraries, technically it's the Board of Regents, but the everyday oversight really falls to the middle of that flow chart where you see the Office of Cultural Education. Below that, you see the New York State Library, and you can see the New York State Library actually has two components to it. A research library, which you can go visit on Madison Avenue in Albany, or you used to be able to. I'm actually not even sure if it's open to the public right now, thanks to COVID. But more importantly, for your purposes, there is the Division of Library Development. And this is the first acronym we're giving you this evening. You might have noticed in the packet we sent you, there's a whole list of acronyms in the back. And that's because library people love acronyms. And I always find that when new trustees start on their board, no one slows down for them. So they just start throwing those acronyms around like you should know what those mean. So now you've got a cheat sheet. This is your first one, DLD, the Division of Library Development. And you'll hear your director talk about the Division of Library Development occasionally, not too often. We don't have a lot of contact with them on a day-to-day basis at the local library level. But if you haven't already heard, you file a report with the state, and that goes to the Division of Library Development for oversight. If you ever have a charter issue, that goes to DLD for management. But again, usually the system where Casey and I work acts as that primary point of contact for your library with state issues. So we are also chartered by the state of New York and the Board of Regents, just like your library is. But the system structure that you see there between the Division of Library Development and public libraries, very interesting organizations. Public library systems only deal with public libraries. You can see there's also school library systems and what they call the 3Rs, reference and research library resources systems. Those 3R systems help all libraries basically that are not school or public libraries. So they help out hospital libraries, law libraries, academic libraries. But for public library systems, we were formed in New York State to help support public libraries throughout the state. There's actually 23 systems broken up by region. We'll show you a map in a couple of slides. And our system is called the Mid-Hudson Library System, which your library is a member of. We're what's called a cooperative public library system, which we'll explain a bit more this evening. And I really kind of wish we weren't directly overhead your library, because while we are tasked and assigned to work as what they call an agent of the state, which sounds way cooler than it is, we're really your partner to help produce quality library service at an affordable price. And what we really focus on is leveraging state money and local dollars to the best advantage of your taxpayers. And we'll talk a little bit tonight about how we do that. But important to understand with this flow chart is also the funding that applies to your library through New York State. This has been a very hot topic this year because of COVID and the ensuing financial crisis. And what you might have discovered, thanks to that perhaps, is how state money influences your library and your ability to produce modern and quality library service for your community. So in New York State, the amount of money that comes to libraries primarily is invested at the system level. However, there is one line of categorical aid that comes right to your library. It's called Local Library Services Aid. You'll also see that on the acronym chart as LLSA, and that amounts to 31 cents per capita or $1,500, whichever is more. So you might know, if you've gotten familiar with your budget, that's not a major revenue source for your library, but certainly not inconsiderable. But the majority of state aid coming to the system level is then invested on your behalf with the help of, I think, a pretty extensive cooperative network that we've built at the Mid-Hudson Library System to make decisions of how to spend that money on your behalf so that you can do more at the local level, that you have access to things that you couldn't otherwise afford as a standalone library. So that's the whole idea of a cooperative library system, that the member libraries of that system join together to figure out ways to find economies of scale, to share knowledge, and to go further together than they ever could if they were standalone libraries. So we'll talk a little bit more about Mid-Hudson in a second. But first, we wanted to talk to you a little bit about your obligations to New York State. We mentioned that there's not a ton of contact, but you do have to file what's called an annual report to the state every year. And if you haven't already experienced that, you will in a couple of months when your director comes to you to have you review the 2020 annual report to the state, and you'll have to sign off on it and vote on it as a board. And now you're going to be taking a look at the statistical information, the financial information, and then there's going to be a form that you have to sign off on, something called the minimum standards for public libraries. And if you take a look in your packet, there's very detailed information on this starting on page 2. But the important thing to understand about minimum standards is that it is tied to your what's called registration in New York State with the Board of Regents. Your library was chartered by the Board of Regents, which means it brought your organization into existence legally, and then you were registered. And to get registered, you had to prove way back when the library was chartered that you meet the minimum standards for being a public library in New York State. Currently, for the year 2020, there are 11 minimum standards. You can chat with your director about these to see if you're in good standing, and you'll be able to confidently sign off that yes, you meet all of these in January next year. You'll notice some of these will involve your attention. There are things here that definitely require board vote, board consideration, board work. If you take a look here at, let's say, number 2, we're going to talk about that tonight, having a long-range plan of service. Maybe making sure an annual report to the community goes out to explain what the library has achieved. That's certainly something you'd want board input on. Tonight we're talking about policies a little bit. Those need to be board approved. So again, you have intersection with number 4 as well. So as we go through all 11 of these, you can see there's different aspects of your work that will overlap with your director on these. So we're going to pull out probably, I think, 5 of these and go, take a deeper dive in them this evening. But we wanted to make sure you saw the whole list at once so you understand this is what you're actually signing off on in the annual report. So I put a little commercial here for you because you're actually serving on the board in a time of transition, and that new minimum standards are going to go into effect for the year 2021. So after you sign off on the 2020 report, attention should be turned to the new minimum standards. And Casey has actually put together a little webinar for trustees specifically coming up on September 22nd if you're interested. If you can't make it that night, there will certainly be recordings and reference material for you to understand what's changing about the minimum standards. There's a couple of tweaks to existing standards and some new ones have been added in that you'll want to have awareness of to make sure that you can move forward in good faith. So coming back to this list of minimum standards, we left off there at policies. Number 5, presenting a board approved budget to the community. If you have a public vote on your budget, that's all taken care of. If you don't have a public vote on your budget, you need to make sure that budget is on your library's website and transparent to the public. Number 6, evaluating effectiveness. When you read the detailed information in your packet on that one, there's a key phrase I wanted to point out to you. It does not ask that you evaluate your effectiveness and being a library among your patrons. They want to see how effective your library is for the community. So many libraries sometimes think they satisfy this standard by putting out a user satisfaction survey to patrons. Hey, do you like our programs? Do you like our hours? Yay, okay, let's go. But what this standard is actually asking you to do is to make sure you understand what your community needs and to see, is your library relevant and responsive in light of what your community needs are? Is there a widespread issue in your community with high school graduation rates or reading levels in 3rd grade or homelessness in your community? And is the library designing plans, programs, services, partnerships that respond to that? So that actual issue of evaluation certainly pulls in library science techniques. Casey is an expert in something called Project Outcome. This is a free tool available to all libraries to help you do outcome-based evaluations. So there's some work to be done in there that you can talk to your director about to see how that's been done in the past. It doesn't require you to do evaluation annually. It leaves it up to the board in terms of how frequent that needs to be, but certainly something that I would hope you would want to see attention given to on a regular basis. Now in your handout, you've got the list of the minimum number of hours you should be opened, which is based on your chartered service population. And this one, I probably should have put 4 asterisks next to this year because we all know library facilities were shuttered for part of 2020 so far because of the COVID pandemic and the hope of flattening the curve, which New York did pretty successfully. And there's also that outside chance that we might have to do that again if we see another peak with the virus. But in a normal year, which we'd all really love to see again, this is the normal minimum number of hours that your library should be open. And if you fell below that, you'd be out of compliance with minimum standards. For this year, you're going to be allowed to put your director will put a variance, a note, or rather just probably a note, letting the state know, well, obviously we were closed and so we couldn't do this every year of the week. But if you ever decide you need to cut costs or you want to rethink or resize services, this is kind of a watermark that you don't go below in normal years. Number 8, a facility that meets community needs. This is kind of, you know it when you see it. This is something that we'll talk a little about tonight too when we think about facility stewardship and making sure all members of your community can access services through your facility. This also has a tinge of COVID related to it for particularly this year, but we'll talk about that for kind of the long-term thinking that you need to put into that one. Number 9, equipment and connections. Most libraries, no problem on this one. You've got computers for the public, broadband connectivity activity. That's what they're really looking for on that one. 10, super simple, printed info about the library. So really just the basics, like your phone number and your website and how you get a library card and what hours you're open. Really basic things so people have a understanding of how to access the services of their own local library. And number 11, you'll see a chart in the handout, a paid director with appropriate education. And they define appropriate education levels depending on the size of the population your library serves. So I would imagine everyone on the call today, you may or may not know if you're meeting all of these. Casey and I have worked on these reports the past 2 years, and most libraries are in really good shape. There might have been a blip if you had a transition, if you had a new director come on board and it's discovered that a former director didn't do something or the new director didn't know they were supposed to do something. There can be a blip there, and Casey can help you figure out how to get a variance request in to fix that. But overall, we're here to help you with this. If you have any issues, if you've got any questions at all, you can contact us at any point. But of course, if you have questions tonight, feel free to put them right in the questions box there that Casey pointed out at the top of the workshop. So Mid-Hudson itself, we serve 5 counties for the most part. We have a unique situation in that we don't serve all of Ulster County. There's 4 libraries in the southeast corner there that southwest corner that decided they didn't want to drive over the mountain, and so they joined the other system in the 1950s. But other than that, we've got all of Greene County, Columbia County, Dutchess County, and Putnam County. We've got 66 libraries total in the system. We are actually the largest system outside of New York City. We have a very large geographical area, 3,000 square miles that we cover. And the benefit, I think, of that to you as trustees is that we're able to learn from all of these libraries across the system. Libraries are usually not too competitive, so they'll share their best practices. And that's part of the work Mid-Hudson does, is to take a look out there at libraries that have hired a new director, built a new building, passed a budget referendum, faced some challenges in policy work, and really create, I think, a clearinghouse of knowledge so that when your board is confronted with a challenging issue, give us a call. We might have helped a library through something really similar. We might have a sample policy that gets you through what you want to do. We can consult with your board to help you learn how to do a capital campaign or pass a budget referendum. So you can tap into that wisdom that we've collected over the years based on the experiences of over 66 libraries, which I think is one of the coolest things about our system. So our library system is governed by a board, just like your library is. We have 15 members, and your libraries actually elect our board. So at our annual meeting in October, you'll see there's 3 seats up for election. The county directors groups actually nominated people for those seats. So it is truly a representative governing board for our system, which is really, I think, a big key to our success. Now, the funding for the system, over the years, this breakdown has changed, particularly after the Great Recession. But currently, our funding revenue is made up of 75% of state aid that comes to us on your behalf, and a 24% investment from your local libraries. Now, your libraries actually vote to tax themselves for system services. Your directors all attend something called the Directors Association, or the DA, another acronym for you. They vote on policy issues related to resource sharing. They vote on what's called the assessment, which is this financial contribution to the system to underwrite services that benefit your library. And they also come together to share best practices and learn from one another, which is incredibly important, particularly for smaller libraries that don't have a lot of staff expertise there to draw from. Learning from some of the larger, more well-funded libraries is a huge benefit to the smaller libraries in our system. And of course, access to the system consultants like Casey and myself is always there to support you. So the system, again, cooperative library system. I just want to talk a little bit about the return on investment and the services there. And then we're going to talk about your type of library and the governance and funding structure of your library. So the state library has estimated for every $1 invested at the Mid-Hudson Library System, your community receives $7 worth of services. So when we think about advocacy at the state level, before we talked about the local library services fund and the direct cash that you get from the state to your library, you may think to yourself that state money isn't very important because you don't see a lot of the cash that you might otherwise see. However, if we think about system services going away and what it would cost your local library to reproduce those services on its own, to have its own integrated library system software, which is called Sierra, would cost literally hundreds of thousands of dollars per library to do that by yourself. To have your own ebook platform, again, tens of thousands of dollars to do that work on your own. So this 1 to 7 return on investment, I think you can understand why the system is so important to what your library is able to do for your local public. So when the tax dollars come in locally to your library, they go far further than they would otherwise if you were not a member of the Mid-Hudson Library System and working together with these 65 other libraries. So the system really serves to facilitate that cooperation, that resource sharing, and that clearinghouse of wisdom that's out there about how to make libraries successful. And that's really a good description, I think, of the system services that your library benefits from. They break into 2 categories primarily: what we call resource sharing, which is the really phenomenal issue that all of our libraries have agreed to share their items with all patrons in the system. We're the only system in the state where that is the case. It exponentially has increased what your patrons have access to. It's not just the items in your building, it's the items in 70 buildings. 66 libraries and their branches can be searched for, requested, and delivered to your local library. An incredible increase to the value you're able to bring right into your local community. So to do that, we have software that facilitates it. We have a delivery service that gets stuff where it needs to go. We have an online interface, which is called Encore, which is our online catalog for people to search things and place holds. If you can't find what you need right in our system, we have an interlibrary loan department, which goes outside of the 5 counties, statewide, nationally, and actually internationally, to find items your patrons may want and get them into their hands across your local library circulation desk. And then we've grown over the past 10 years building an e-resource collection that's available to every member of the system. So all patrons have access to ebooks, downloadable audiobooks, e-magazines, job and career source help. These are resources, again, that your library may or may not be able to afford on its own, but by us all working together, every patron in the system has access to this. So when you think about that, in the Hudson Valley, there's just over 630,000 people living in the Mid-Hudson Valley, and 308,000 of them are library card holders. Approaching 50% of residents of all ages throughout this region are using local public libraries because they really believe in them. And so your ability to meet their needs is really, I think pretty cool. Showing that we really work together is an important aspect of showing that tax dollars are used wisely, and something I think we can all hold our heads up high with. It's really the gold standard of seeing tax dollars used well, that you work together to maximize them rather than duplicate services over and over again in every town and every county. So we're proud to be a part of that equation and help your library present these level of services to your community. The other side of our business is really library development, which you are experiencing right now live during this webinar. Continuing education and professional development, workshops, webinars, consultations, technology support. Many of you have your tech support contracts with us. Advocacy and awareness work to raise the profile of libraries in your local community with county legislators, state legislators, federal legislators, and really helping to hone in on some special populations who might have barriers to access library services and giving them a boost to get to factual information and quality programs that your staff may not specialize in, but if, again, we all pool our resources, we can do a better job of serving everyone in our community, regardless of their background or ability. So we have a plan of service that we operate under. If you're interested to read that, it's right on our website, as are all of our board documents. If you want to take a look at our financial documentation, our last audit, our library board, our system board reports, our board is extremely transparent. So right on midhudson.org, go under About Mid-Hudson. You can see the plan, check out the board documents. If you have any questions at all, just let us know. Sometimes you might get a knock on the door from one of our system trustees. They'd love to come and visit you. Even with their online meetings, they're interested to come and visit and hear what's going on. They want to make sure they understand the issues that you're facing so they make good decisions on your behalf when they're sitting at the governing table of the Mid-Hudson Library System's Board of Trustees. So we're going to do one more thing, and then we're going to pause for questions. So if you've got questions bubbling up, feel free to start writing them in the question box, or get ready for that question and answer period. But first, I want to talk about types of libraries. This is closer to home, talking about your governance structure and the legal entity that is your library. Now, there's a chart on page 8 of your packet that explains what I'm about to say in detail. So if you're like, oh my God, I missed that, don't worry. You've got documentation that backs it up. And of course, you can always ask us questions. But there's 4 types of libraries, and you can't tell the difference just by walking in the door of a library or checking out their website. This is really going to the heart of how the library is legally structured in terms of your funding and your governance. So most libraries, I would say, you have a charter document, which that's where you can figure out your legal status. Hopefully you know your legal status, what type of library you are. If you're not, put a big asterisk in your notebook right now to find out what type of library you are, because it is really important for trustees to understand this, because it dictates which laws and regulations apply to your library, which is very important to understand as you make governance and policy decisions. So about half the libraries in our system are what are called association libraries, so a very common and prevalent type of library. They are, I think, most known for usually being the earliest formed libraries in our region. This is back before there really was a education department that was overseeing libraries. We have actually the 2 oldest libraries in the state are in our system, the Star Library in Rhinebeck and the Grinnell Library in Wappingers Falls. They were formed back in the 1800s. So these really are libraries with long histories usually. And association libraries were formed when a group of people in the community got together and thought it was a good idea to have a library. They made it happen. Very much represents what you might consider a regular not-for-profit structure with a board of trustees that is volunteer-based, that are what they call self-perpetuating. So if there is a vacancy, and I bet some of you know exactly what I'm about to say, someone comes and asks you, would you like to be on the board? It's only 12 meetings a year, and you're like, oh, that sounds great. I love the library. Okay, you're in, right? They just choose their own peers on the board. The funding structure for association libraries definitely varies. There's contracts some association libraries have with their municipality to provide library service in the region, but the majority, vast majority of association libraries now have had at least one public vote on the tax levy for library services, which is really critical. We're going to talk more about that when we talk about your financial responsibilities. So association libraries much more likely to be doing fundraising to make ends meet. Usually they've gotten a late start in having the tax levy cover mission critical items. So you may find association libraries rely more heavily on fundraising, which might be a board activity that you're engaged in. You do not have, right out of the gate, you don't have the right to do capital bonds. So if you had a big expansion project or wanted to build a new library, you might have trouble doing capital bonding, meaning having the community tax itself to basically bond out your project. If you had a really big project over probably $4.5 million, then we could probably get you into a DASNY bonding situation. But most association libraries are smaller. Their construction projects don't hit that level, which means traditional fundraising, grant writing, capital campaigns come into play for any really large construction projects. Your library does not fall under civil service, which some directors are very pleased about. It gives them a little more flexibility with hiring, which a lot of libraries, especially smaller libraries, appreciate. Now you'll notice the other 3 types of libraries fall under the heading of public libraries. And that is a very important distinction, because public libraries are held to different standards. There are some different laws that you're required to follow. You'll notice if you went down to the bottom of that table that public libraries do fall under civil service. They do have access to capital bonding either through their municipality or their school district. So coming back up to the top of the chart, all types of public libraries, you can see there, the board is not self-perpetuating. In a municipal library setting, the board is appointed by the municipality that you serve. So it's really a political appointment, which is a very different construct than being self-perpetuating or being elected by the public. So it definitely comes with some complications. The funding might be an appropriation, or also could be a public vote, the way association libraries are able to have a public vote. And again, we'll explain that more in the financial section. The other two types of libraries, you'll notice what they have in common is the word district. There's school district public libraries, which are libraries that are not owned by the school district. They're autonomous entities. They happen to have the same service area as a school district. So the same boundaries define the district for voters. And then the voters in that district elect the Board of Trustees and vote on how much to tax themselves for library services. And that comes inherently with that type of library. You automatically have the right to go to the voters annually, which is a huge difference than the municipal and association libraries. And when you look at a list of the types of libraries in our system, you'll notice often the school district public libraries and special district public libraries are better funded because of this. This annual vote and this connection they have with voters makes a huge difference. Special district libraries are formed when there might be more than one library in a school district, so no one library can claim that school district. Special district libraries have to go through quite a journey to come into existence. They have to have legislation passed at the state level. So in Albany, the legislature has to have a bill just for your little library that got passed. It had to be signed into law by the governor. Your area had to vote on that legislation to create your district. So a special vote was held to create your special district. But once it was formed, it created this annual connection with those voters. Now they elect your board of trustees. Now they vote annually on how much to tax themselves for library services. And again, you have the ability to go back to them for capital bonds, but you do fall under civil service and a couple of other laws that impact the standards that you're held to because you have those rights to come to the public and ask for additional tax monies. So the two types of districts are the recommended model from the Division of Library Development. It has been found to create financial stability. It provides taxation with representation with an elected board. And we just find that there is significantly more sustainability in terms of the financial forecasting for district libraries because of that annual vote opportunity that you have. So the municipal and association libraries, they work hard for their money. Municipal libraries, if they don't have a vote in place already, you are going hat in hand every year to your municipality and making the case for the amount of money that you think the library needs to run for the year to meet the needs of the community. You can be cut at any time if there is no public vote in place. So there's only a handful of those left because in Mid-Hudson, we've made it a very top priority over the past 20 years to have as many libraries in our system as possible have a public vote on the tax levy. Because once you have that vote in place, it locks it in. That's your basement floor. You can't be cut below it, and the voters are in control. They decide when that budget goes up, not an elected official who may or may not understand the value of a library to their community. So if your library does not have a public vote or hasn't had one in a very long time, I encourage you to talk to your library's finance committee. Find out why not. What are the barriers? Should we explore this? Could we get on the ballot in the coming years? We highly recommend you do so, and we have a very deep bench of knowledge of how to help you win those votes. We are actually known statewide for our help in this area and are called upon statewide to help libraries get on the ballot and pass those budget initiatives. So if you need help with that, don't hesitate to call. We know how important it is to get enough money to cover your operating expenses so you can meet the needs of your community without worrying about keeping the lights on or paying your staff on a monthly basis. So Casey, I'm going to pause here and see if we've got questions that have come up in this first section about the library network in New York State.
All right, so I don't see any questions right now that have come up in the box about the first section. We did have a lot of folks reply. If you have any questions, please pop them in the questions box. But I just wanted to report that we did have a lot of folks reply about how long they've been on the board and what library they're representing. And I think the winner for the least amount of time on the board is Rita from the Town of Ulster Library. She's been there 6 weeks at this point. And we have, for the longest time served on the board, we have Kathy from the Germantown Library, who said she served 12 years on the board, but that she in fact had 1 year off for good behavior.
Hi, Kathy. Nice to have you here tonight. So very cool. I think that good sense of humor there. I think that also speaks to the longevity of public library service for trustees, that it's rewarding work. You really see the results of the energy that you put in as a volunteer. You get to see that the decisions you make a big difference in people's life. When you think about how critical library service is to so many people in our communities, from families who are trying to help their kids get off to a great start in school, to students who might be struggling as they're a little further into school. That's a huge issue right now with COVID-19 and the struggles of our school districts, to the adults who maybe don't have internet at home and rely on the library to provide that. You are providing and helping to provide critical services to people. And that's why you see people like Kathy, who serve so many years at their libraries, because they really, I hope, are feeling the payoff of that energy they put into it.
Yes, indeed. So I don't see any other questions right now. I don't see anything coming in on chat or in the question box, but everybody's welcome to put in questions as we go through the webinar. If we find a minute, we'll insert it there as soon as we can, or we have these breaks built in so that we can answer some questions as we go through.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Casey.
You're welcome.
We're going to go to the second section here and talk about trustee roles and responsibilities. And you might have already flipped to the trustee job description page and kind of eyed that very long list that's there. We're going to try to demystify that for you, explain the basics of it so you understand what they're talking about in each of those items. I think the most important thing we want to talk about when it comes to roles and responsibilities is that you are really part of a team. You're not on your own. You're not there without technical assistance. You've got a library director who hopefully is experienced in their field. You've got access to people like Casey and myself whenever you need us to answer questions. You have hopefully access to legal counsel and financial counseling through an auditor or your bookkeeping staff or professional treasurer. So you're not on your own. That's very important to understand. You're working in concert with some really key stakeholders to produce quality library service for your community. So what we want to do is just run over your kind of basic duties and responsibilities, and we'll talk about that stakeholder network that you're a part of that is helping to make your library successful. So in your trustee page 9 there, you see that trustee job description. And we pulled out a couple of points from what's called the Statement on the Governance Role of a Trustee or Board Member from the New York State Board of Regents. And so just a reminder, that is that body that oversees the entire education department that has ultimate authority over library boards. So it's a document that's, I think, pretty important to have scanned as you are now a trustee of a local library. But they point out the 3 duties of trustees. And of course, this applies to all trustees and board members of not only libraries, but school districts and higher education as well. They talk about the duty of care, the idea that you have to act in good faith, that you're putting the library above perhaps personal interest, which is also related to the duty of loyalty, that you have allegiance to the institution. So if you see a way through the library that you might personally financially benefit, or you could financially benefit a family member, that should be a big red caution flag for you, because that's not the idea of what trustees are doing on the board. We want to make sure that the library is always center at the decisions that you make, doing the best you can for the institution that you've been entrusted with. And so again, that means putting the organization ahead of perhaps personal interests or other volunteer work that you do in the community. That's the kind of trust that has been put into you as the trustees of the library. And the last one there, I do wish it was called something different, but it is called the duty of obedience, which is to fulfill the mission of the library, to take that very seriously, to make sure you've actually read the mission of the library, understand what everyone thinks at your board table that it means, and really work towards fulfilling it, to truly contribute to the lifelong learning of the people in your community, to truly help people overcome barriers and access information. So it sounds maybe so basic, right, that you take a look at the mission statement and you make sure it happens. That seems very basic, but you'd be surprised at how often boards can kind of go off on a path that really has nothing to do with library service, and all of a sudden they've produced a scholarship program for people that really don't speak to library services. Or we've had libraries that have kind of gone off the reservation and tried to duplicate services that are being done by another agency in the community. And sometimes that needs course correction. And as a new trustee, you can sometimes bring that perspective to the board table. If you notice something that doesn't kind of line up with a mission statement or with the plan of service or with law, just for instance, you can be that person who says, can you explain this, please? This doesn't quite look the way I understand it, or what I read in the trustee handbook, or what what I heard Rebecca or Casey talk about at a webinar I went to. That's part of your responsibility, is to kind of have a reality check. Sometimes you land on a board where everybody else has been there for a couple of decades and they've just kind of always done things that way and haven't really thought much about why they might do it. And believe it or not, they will appreciate that you ask those questions. So they analyze why they're doing what they're doing and get fresh eyes on it. Now, the list of responsibilities that you see on the trustee handbook, that honestly is the bulk of the trustee handbook. It goes in depth on all of these things. What we've done for you tonight is boiled it down quickly, obviously for a pretty quick webinar we're doing here tonight, to get the highlights for you as a new person, if you haven't had time to sit down and read the whole handbook. But this is the list of responsibilities that you see in the handbook. And you can see a lot of people helped with that handbook, including the state library, which oversees libraries. So if there was an issue that a library board was not fulfilling these responsibilities and someone reported you to the state, consider the handbook kind of the Bible. That's what they're actually going to refer back to say, has the library board met these standards? Even the Office of the State Comptroller refers to the handbook for library trustees of New York State to make decisions when they receive complaints about library boards. So not just because my name is on the cover do I think it's an important book. It's just proven over time to be the go-to reference for library trustee and the work that you do. So an important publication, I think, for you to have access to. So on page 11 in your packet, you've got a little chart that's called Working Together, that really kind of itemizes the relationship between the director, the board of trustees, and your friends group, if you're lucky enough to have a Friends the Library group. And it itemizes the different responsibilities in the areas of administration or advocacy work or finances. But at the end of the day, I think this is a really kind of almost simple way to keep in mind which lane is yours. And I say that deliberately. Your director's job is to manage the library on a day-to-day basis, and they do that using governance documents that the board has put in place. So the trustees, as the governing board of the library, you have put in place a plan of service, a budget, and policies. And those are the things your director uses to carry out the day-to-day operations of your library. So we're going to talk about those three things to make sure you're clear on what those documents are, how they get used in your library. But you'll see if you find yourself kind of starting to tell the director how to run the library on a day-to-day basis, or I think you should move the cash register over to the left side of the desk. That's probably not the level you should be operating at as a library trustee. You are really charged with a governance level of the organization. So again, making sure there's the finances are in place, that there is good oversight of those finances, that the right policies are in place, and that you have a viable long-range plan of service that truly speaks to the needs of your community. Trust me, that is work aplenty for a board of trustees. It might look more fun to pick the books and figure out the arrangement of things in the library, but really that is why you've hired your director, to be that day-to-day manager of the building, to manage patrons, staff complaints, the collection, the technology, the facility. They are your day-to-day agent to do that work. That's why you are, as volunteers, there's no way you have enough time to do all of that in a fully, I think, responsible way, which is why you've hired a library director, which is required by the state that you have a paid director. So the other thing I'll point out on that chart there is how critical a friends group can be to success. And you might have a friends group, you might not. Just over half of libraries in the system have a friends group. And some have had awesome experiences with those friends groups. Others have had unfriendly friends groups that have quite the epic story behind them. But at the end of the day, they're there to support the organization. They are goodwill ambassadors, getting the word out about the library. They are helping to raise funds that augment the budget. They shouldn't be doing fundraising that keeps the lights on at the library, but they're doing fundraising that diversifies your revenue stream so that you get some extra money coming in that might offset the cost of a special program or project or piece of technology. But if you find yourself sitting at the board table of a library where fundraising is what keeps the lights on and keeps the staff paid, that's a warning sign that there's some work to be done to bolster the tax support that your library receives. What you want to do is see your budget revenues coming in where really honestly close to 80% or more of your revenue comes from the tax base to make sure your organization is stable. And it's important to diversify where your revenue comes. You definitely want to show the taxpayers that you've sought out other revenue streams. But if you're always constantly chasing money from sources that you can't count on from year to year, it really destabilizes an important cultural and educational institution in your community, which is your library. And that's hard for some boards to hear, but I can put you in touch with literally dozens, if not hundreds of library boards that will attest to what I just said. When they do that work to raise up the amount they're getting through the tax base, it completely changes the landscape for their library, and it really increases the quality of services they're able to provide because they can focus on governing that library and developing quality services to deliver to the community. You don't want to see bake sales keeping the doors to your library open. A really famous story in our system is the Stone Ridge Library. When I started at the system, they had, and they still do have a fabulous library fair. It's wonderful. But in maybe 2.5 decades ago, that was one of the major fundraisers that funded the library for the year. And one year it rained on the weekend of the library fair, and their income didn't come in at the level they'd projected, which meant in November they were out of money to pay the staff. And the very next year, they pursued becoming a special district library to change the financial outlook for their organization, which again completely stabilized the organization, created a dependable revenue stream, a direct relationship with the voters that really can change the history of your library. So your relationship with the library director is going to be the most important relationship, and you've got a whole handout on page 12 about this issue because it's so critical. The lines of communication needs to be open and excellent. You need to respect the hierarchy and chain of command in your organization. And what I mean by that is you are many, right? On your board of trustees, the New York State allows for anywhere from 5 to 25 trustees on a library board. We only have one library that has a 25-member board, so count your blessings. But imagine having let's say an 11-member board, which is very common in our system. The director can't have 11 people coming at them and asking questions and telling them to do things, right? So the board is what's called the collective authority. You have authority when you're at the board table in an open meeting setting, which we'll describe in a minute. So you can't just walk in the library on a Tuesday morning and say, I'd like to see this changed, or I think you should spend more money on this area of the collection. As an individual trustee, you are definitely a VIP, a very important patron. You are serving the library, people respect and honor the time that you give the institution. But again, the authority lies with the collective. So at the board table is where you have the power to change policy, to amend the budget, to change strategy when it comes to your long range plan. And again, your director will thank you, particularly when you become board president, to respect that. Otherwise, things can go haywire very quickly. The other thing to keep in mind is the chain of command in the staffing structure of the library. You actually only oversee one employee of the library, and that is the director. And that's why it's important to have a written contract with them and an evaluation process that's in place to make sure expectations are clear and assessment is done routinely. Your board president will be the primary point of contact with the director on a regular basis in between board meetings. But when it comes to staff connections with the board, you might have a staff member come to you and issue a complaint. Maybe they're unhappy about their hours, or they really don't like the color that was chosen for the renovation in the children's room. That's not your problem. That is the joy of having hired a director. You get to refer that staff person right back to the director. That's their direct supervisory line. They should be dealing with the director. There are two caveats to this. If a staff person came to you with a complaint about sexual harassment by the director, you would obviously take that extremely seriously. You would kick into gear. You probably have a sexual harassment policy. Well, you better have a sexual harassment prevention policy. It's required by law. If you don't, quick, get one. That certainly is something you would trigger a process that's already built into your policy structure. The other thing you would immediately act on is if a staff person who is not the director approached you about financial malfeasance, where they think someone might be pocketing money or writing checks to a fake account, or that something just doesn't quite look right in the books. That's a whistleblower coming to you and trying to protect the public's interest. That again is something the board would immediately take action on based on the policy that you've adopted at your library. Anything else, move it back down to the director. Let them know you were contacted by the staff person and give them a heads up that that's coming. And make sure the staff person understands that it's not that their concern isn't important, you're just not the right person to bring it to at this time. There's a grievance procedure in your personnel policy. If they feel they're not getting satisfaction from their supervisor or the director, that needs to be followed. So again, do yourself a favor and understand the chain of command at your library. You'll save yourself a lot of headaches. A number of new trustees immediately get sucked into some drama at the front lines of the library that's unnecessary because they didn't quite understand how that worked. So now you know. So the annual evaluations, I just wanted to take a minute to point out, you might think to yourself, our director is amazing, she's wonderful, we love everything she does, we don't need to evaluate her, we'll just like give her a high five at every board meeting. But actually it's absolutely critical that you evaluate your director on an annual basis, particularly when they're doing a good job, because you want to be able to tell them in writing, you're doing a great job, thank you so much, please keep it up. And then when you've established that pattern, it makes it far easier to deal with issues when they're maybe not going so great, when maybe the director has slipped on something or hasn't lived up to the expectations of the board. And it provides a formal structure to have a conversation about how to improve that situation. That doesn't mean you wait when there's a major problem with the director until the annual evaluation. The board president or the executive committee could certainly sit down with the director to address an immediate problem. But that annual evaluation process leaves that door open for the formal conversation, which can really make a huge difference in the relationship with the director over the long term. Now that has to go hand in hand with evaluation of the board. You are a team. You're the governing team and they are the management team, but it only works when you work together. So making sure there's a process in place for board evaluation that goes hand in hand with this is pretty important. If that's something your board's not doing right now, let us know. We're happy to show you examples of how other boards do it and advise you on that. But again, it's a chance for the board to identify what they feel they're doing great, what they think they might need some more help on. Maybe they didn't get orientation when they started on the board, or they didn't know they could come to a workshop like this at Mid-Hudson, and they didn't understand how things worked. By having a conversation like that on an annual basis, you can find little things to fix, and sometimes you find big things to fix that make a huge, huge difference. So this chart here is on page 14 in your packet. It's really, it's a kind of graphical representation of everything we're talking about here today, but I wanted to put it in front of you to just point out everything's connected, right? You know, when you as a board act in a transparent and accountable way, and you base your plans on what the community needs, and you produce services that people really care about, and it matters to them, and it makes a difference in their lives, and you find partners in the community that are also working to improve the life of people in your community, and you get the word out about what you're doing, that's how you get to sustainable funding for your library, because you're able to prove what you do matters, that you're making good use of funding, that you're a trustworthy organization, and it inspires voters to vote yes. It inspires people to volunteer for your board or for your friends group, or to write a check for a fundraising campaign that you're doing. So all the things we're talking tonight, they certainly don't stand alone. They're all connected in this kind of cycle that creates a library that's really worthy of investment in your community. And so there's many things that go into this that you'll touch on while you're on the board. You might be involved in a planning cycle where you, as a new trustee, just a tip, find out where your library's long-range plan is. Take a look at the years on it. Are you in the middle of it? Are you near the beginning of it? Are you at the end of it? Did it pass by a couple years ago? That'll tell you if you're going to be involved in a planning cycle or not. But you've got a handout that talks about the steps for this. This is something we do on-demand consultations for. I just wanted to point out real quick that step number 3, gathering input from your community, is really critical. That you really should not be creating plans of service without talking to the community and listening to what they have to say. We have a whole program at Mid-Hudson called the Turning Outward program that Casey runs. We've had, I think about, we're up to 14 or 15 libraries now that have gone through this process with us. We use something called Libraries Transforming Communities to help you tap into what community members vision for the future of your community. So it's a shift from old planning where we used to ask people, what do you want your library to do? And I can tell you right now, the answers that they'll give you. They'll say, I want more hours, I want more DVDs, I want more, right? And that's not really telling you about what the outcomes should look like. More is not necessarily an outcome. It's certainly a quantitative outcome, but not a qualitative outcome. What we want to do is design services, programs, partnerships, and utilize technology in the facility in a way that truly advances a community's vision for itself. And so taking the time to find out what kind of community people want to live in, and then coming back to the board table, to staff meetings, using library science to design goals, outcomes, services, programs that respond to that need, that the community is the expert in. That's how we're starting to build the most successful libraries in our system, is shifting the thinking around that planning model. So as you can tell, we could talk about this for the whole 90 minutes, but we're not going to do that tonight. If you're interested in this, again, you can have an on-demand consultation. Casey and I can come and talk to your board. Or if your library knows it needs to do planning in the next 12 to 18 months, might want to keep your eye out for that Turning Outward program next year. We're looking to convert that to a fully online program in acknowledgement of COVID-19. So securing adequate funding, a huge issue for libraries. Making sure that you have enough funding to meet the needs of your community might be a process. You might not get there overnight, but it's certainly something that needs attention on a regular basis. Your library is not a charity. You, again, are an educational institution under the state education department. So for libraries that you have been run like a charity where, boy, I hope someone writes us a check so we can keep going this year, not a long-term sustainable plan for stabilizing the organization. So again, as I've already said, you want to make sure those mission critical costs are covered by a stable and sustainable source, hopefully voter approved funds, and all libraries have the ability to go to the voters for funding. So if you'll recall, when we talked about types of libraries, we mentioned the district libraries, they automatically go out for a vote. But association and municipal libraries, they've got to take some extra steps to get on the ballot. They have two options: either a municipal ballot vote, which is often called a 414 vote. 414 refers to the chapter of law in 1995 that allowed for this action. There's a petition process where you have to get signatures from registered voters in your town that equal 10% of the number of voters that voted in the last gubernatorial election. Now, that was a mouthful. It's a long process. You probably won't be surprised when I tell you there's also a handbook just for that, if you want to do that. If you haven't done it in a long time and that's the way your library's been successful in the past, one of the things we advocate is that your library gets into a pattern of doing these votes every 2 to 3 years, so your voters get used to voting on the library's tax levy. The longer you wait between votes, there's a fallacy there that a lot of trustees think, well, the community will be so grateful that we made it work for 7, 8 years without coming back to them. But voters have a very short memory, to be honest with you. And what we've learned over time is that when you wait that long, it usually means by the time you go back to them, you need to ask for a double-digit increase. And that seems unreasonable to most voters because they're used to seeing increases in the cost of living range, in the tax cap range. They're seeing increases at the town and school district levels that don't look anything like a double-digit increase. So you want to be able to get closer to staying near the cap, if not under the cap. And that takes some planning and getting into a routine of that 2 to 3 year window of going out for a vote. The other option is a school district ballot vote, sometimes called a 259 vote, which refers to the section of education law, which gives you the right to do this type of vote. Much easier type of vote. I think you need 25 signatures to get on the ballot in a school district and ask the residents of that school district to tax themselves for library services. The complication in our region is that you are rarely the only library in one school district. If you were, you probably are already a school district public library. If you're not already, then I would say, hey, go for it. This is a very easy way to get on the ballot and can really make life a lot easier for you. But if you have multiple libraries in one school district, this is a diplomatic minefield, and it's something you're probably going to need some consultative help on. So if you need more information on that, there's resources on our website at midhudson.org in the topics area under sustainable libraries. And it's something that, again, Casey and I both consult on as well. No fee for consulting. Give us a call, an email, ask for meetings anytime, and we're happy to help out with that type of thing. So the other side of that is not just securing the money, but is overseeing the money and making sure that you're carrying out your fiduciary responsibility. It's not your money, right? It's the public's money. It's your donor's money. It's the state's money. It's the county's money. It's certainly not your money. It's not the board's money. You have been entrusted with it on behalf of people who really believe in libraries, whether because law a long time ago made that possible, or out of the passion of a yes vote or a check that's been donated to you. So making sure there's great fiscal policies in place, that you're having a third-party audit on a regular basis. These are all fiscal controls that you can put in place, because I'm guessing many of you are not CPAs yourself. You're not necessarily experts in municipal financing or anything like that, but there are definitely guidelines to follow, recommended policies to have in place that you'll see on the checklist that we provide to you. Because I'll tell you something, the mismanagement of public funds, absolutely easiest way to ruin the library's reputation. We've all seen the headlines, right, of a fire district or a town clerk that has somehow managed to abscond with money or skim money over the years, and it ruins the reputation of that organization for a decade or more. It's very hard to get back. So you want to make sure that you are doing everything in good faith that a normal average citizen would do to protect the assets of the library. And those fall into, like I said, the fiscal policies that you'll have, the budget that you pass, the reports that you review on a regular basis. We offer a whole workshop just on the financial responsibility, because as you can imagine, this is more involved than we can get into tonight. So again, another resource for you to consider. Now, I just mentioned those fiscal policies. There's a policy-making role for you on the Board of Trustees. Now, most of you coming into your boards these days, most of the policies are in place already, because we've done a lot of work in the past decade to help libraries with that. But it truly is the board's ultimate responsibility to ensure and protect the reputation of the institution. And putting in writing your intent for how you're going to do that manifests itself in policy. It sounds super boring, I know. Some of you might be excited about it. I don't want to say everyone is. But the best piece of advice I ever got was for policy committees to recruit the most jaded people on the board to be on them. Because really, you have to think about worst case scenario, the stuff you hope never happens, the worst of humanity. What if someone tried to steal from us? What if someone misbehaved in the library? We have to think about what policies have to be in place to protect the library, the public, the staff, and the library's assets, including the financial assets. So you'll see in your packet a list of recommended policies, and this is from the Trustee Handbook. We actually have a custom report on this for each library in our system. If you're interested, just request it from us to show what policies you already have and which ones probably need some work. We can help you get a sense of that if you don't already have a policy audit done in your organization. But you'll see here on this list, there's a lot of things on this list. And one thing I'm really happy to be able to tell you is that there are samples of almost everything you see on this list. You can get right through our website at midhudson.org. Again, in our topics area, there's a whole policy collection from libraries around our system, the state, and the country that help inform policy making at your library. So I'll just point out there's two categories there on that checklist. You'll notice it starts there on the left with an external list. External means those policies that are public facing, the ones that govern the interaction of the public with your resources, with your technology, with your staff, all sorts of things. As you can imagine, the minute you open your doors to the public and anyone can walk through those doors, really anything can happen. And we have a lot of stories we can tell you. But we just wanted to point out a couple of them to you here tonight. In the external side, on the circulation section, in here we have patron confidentiality and law enforcement inquiry. And something you may or may not know is there's actually a state law, a New York state law that protects library record privacy. So the state understands how important it is to protect people's privacy and what they read at the library, what they look at the library. That if you can't freely read and freely learn about things, you can't necessarily understand the world around you. So there's actually a state law protects patron privacy, which can create some awkward situations sometimes. If you had a law enforcement officer, maybe a state trooper, comes in the library and wants to see a list of everyone who's taken out books about graffiti, because there's graffiti on the back of the high school and they found a library book back there. Your library staff might immediately think, of course I want to help the state trooper. They're trying to do good work for our community. But by law, they may not turn over patron information without a legal document. So a court order would have to be issued for the library staff to release any information about a patron. So some of the policies on this list are tied into law. They're not just a good idea, they're required by law. A couple of other ones that you see on here that are required by law Accessibility, if your library is not fully accessible to a person with a physical disability, you have to have a policy in place that indicates how you provide equity of service to that person. They deserve the same level of access, but if they can't get in your building, you have to have a solution for that. Is it going to be curbside service? Will it be online service? Will it be a relationship with a neighboring library? Of course, all of our libraries work really well together, so you already have that, which is great, but you'll want to be able to demonstrate that you're working on it. You're working on a solution to make sure anyone can walk through your doors regardless of their physical ability. Another one tied to law is on the internal side. The internal policy collection there are related to kind of like, if you think about a restaurant, it's like the back of house stuff. It's the stuff that goes on behind the scenes to make sure everything goes smoothly. Now, looking at that first section under the board, the conflict of interest policy is actually required by state law. And if you take a look at your policy, I guess a good way for you to know as a new trustee if your policy is compliant with the law is whether or not you are asked to sign an annual disclosure statement to disclose any financial conflict of interest you might have. That would be a way to know that your policy is up to date or not. If your policy is before 2011, it's likely out of date with law. So again, we could go through these policies for literally hours. There are things to understand about all of them, but I want to point out the next section there in internal under financial controls and the one after that personnel. Those are incredibly important. The financial controls, that's that fiscal oversight responsibility that you have. You want to make sure those policies are in place. And the personnel area, your staff are your greatest asset that you have. They truly are the library. People love your staff. They come in just to see them sometimes. You can be made or broken by how you treat your staff. So making sure they're treated fairly and consistently, policies do that for you. And they answer those sticky questions that can come up for your director. So a complete set of those personnel policies and financial policies are really, really critical. If you need help with that, let us know. We've got a ton of resources in this area to help you out. One more policy I wanted to talk about before we move on here, in the public space area. So if we're on the left-hand column under external, go down to public space, we see a patron behavior / code of conduct. Now, your library building is what's called a limited public forum. It means anyone can walk through the doors of your building, but it does not mean they can behave any way they choose. You set the rules at the library for what's acceptable. As long as you're not violating anyone's civil rights, you can set the rules. So it means that if someone is acting in a harassing way towards other patrons or staff, you have a process in place for the staff to ask that person to change that behavior or be asked to leave the library or even suspend their library privileges for a period of time. If someone is abusing the library computers or hacking into them or changing the screensaver to say naughty words, that the staff has the right to intervene and course correct that type of behavior on behalf of everyone who uses the library. The idea there behind that policy is that you want to create an environment that is welcoming to the majority of people that come through that door. Now, you're going to have outliers. You're going to have people that might have mental illness issues that are struggling. You're going to have people that are having a bad day and have an outburst at the library. Your staff needs clear guidance on how to manage those situations. And the policies that are created give that stability and consistency to staff. So your director can train your staff on those policies so they know what to do in those one-off situations or really challenging situations, which can be emotionally distressing for your staff. They need a fighting chance to do a good job there, both to protect the reputation of the library, but to also respect the rights of the workers at your library and the people who come to use your library. So I just can't stress enough how important policies are. And if you find yourself at a library that's missing a lot of these policies, that might be a place to put some energy, is to get on that policy committee and help make this list more complete for your library. We've got a whole new workshop coming up here called Core Values and Ethics. It's a new one we're doing this year with the opportunity that COVID has given us to do things a little differently. So if you're interested in thinking more about policy and ethics and the work that goes into this might be a workshop you're interested in. Part of your policy planning is related to your facilities, and we talked about your fiduciary responsibility for facilities. This is another area that you might not have a deep expertise in as an individual or even as a board, but you are responsible for a very expensive asset of the library, which is the library building. So if your library doesn't have a building plan or a facility plan, we recommend that you work on that, getting a sense of what major expenditures are coming up related to the building. Maybe the roof needs to be replaced in the next few years, and it'd be good to have a multi-year financial plan for how that will be paid for. Maybe you've identified that your building's not fully accessible to people with disabilities, and that's going to be a major renovation project to fix that issue. Those are multi-year efforts that take a lot of planning, some foresight, obviously takes some money to be invested in them. So this plan needs to be part of your financial planning for the long term of your library. This is actually available as a Microsoft Word document. It's incredibly simple. We know it's not involved. It's not like hiring a consultant to do this work for you. But for a smaller library who maybe doesn't have the wherewithal to hire a national building consultant to come in and help them, it at least gets you to the basics. It gets you to have a handle on the useful life maintenance and replacement schedule of what major costs might be coming up. It helps you do assessments related to safety, accessibility, energy conservation, and the changing needs of people in our libraries. Many of our library buildings in this region were literally built hundreds of years ago. We have 40% of the libraries in the system were built over 100 years ago. So obviously they're not necessarily built or wired for what needs to happen in a modern public library. And there might be some thinking to be done in that area. So if that's energizing to you, maybe work to get on the facilities committee. That could be a fun and rewarding place for you. So the I think next to last one I want to talk to you about here is promoting the library. I called it this one the if not you then who responsibility. You obviously really believe in libraries. You could have chosen to volunteer your time at a multitude of organizations, and you chose the local library. And I got to believe that's because you believe it's important, that it provides an important service to the community, that it matters, right? And someone like you who is giving yourself, your time, your energy, your expertise, your talent, you are the best possible person to speak about why the library matters because you're speaking from the heart. You're not getting a paycheck for working at the library. You're doing it because that's where you choose to volunteer your time. And so, number one, you are the best possible spokesperson for your library. I know we love to default to our directors to do that work, and they do an awesome job too, but you should be on the front lines of that work too. And whatever format works for you. Each of our personalities is a little different. Some of us don't mind getting up in front of a crowd. Others of us, that's the last thing we want to do, and we might be more effective writing a letter to the editor or a social media post. Find your comfort zone, but get your talking points done. Make sure you know what your library has to offer and help connect people with it. You'd be shocked at how little people understand what your library has to offer. Get to know what's on your library's website. Get a tour of the library building when it's a safer maybe time, but understand what's available because there's a rare person that you can't impress and surprise with what your library has to offer. People have a lot of assumptions about libraries that are really off the mark, and that's part of our work right now is to clarify for people what libraries really do. We're not just warehouses of books. We are educational institutions doing life-changing work, creating connections and providing catalysts for really amazing things in people's lives. And that's a story that has to be told, and that's part of our work right now. So definitely make sure there's money in the budget for public relations to help get that word out. Get to know decision makers if you don't already know your town supervisor, county legislators, state legislators. Those are good people to have connections with and to know before you need their help. So I think it's one of the kind of disingenuous things we often do is we don't think to connect with someone until we need something from them. But cultivating relationships with people who are trying to do good work in the community too can go a long way to solving problems that might happen in the future at your library. But again, you got to be deliberate about this. We can't leave this kind of stuff to chance anymore. There's too much static in the world to cut through to make sure people connect with their local library and understand why it's valuable. And this is definitely part of that sustainable library cycle that if you want people to be inspired and invest in the library in the future, this kind of work has to be done deliberately and proudly to tell the story of what the library is really up to in the community. So Casey, I'm going to pause here and see if any questions have come in here during this second section of roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, so while we were talking about policies, we had a question about whether we have any sample policies or statements of commitment regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Oh, what an awesome question. That is such a good question. We need to build up our examples of that on the website, but are there examples? Absolutely. Do a quick Google search on EDI statements from public libraries. You're going to find some stuff, and it's a growing body of work. So it's definitely on our to-do list to bulk up our clearinghouse of examples. And if you need some help with that, let us know. It'll move it up on our to-do list. But absolutely, we're seeing statements, and Mid-Hudson Library Board issued a statement. The Kingston Library issued an amazing statement on the topic. And we're starting to see it not only made like as a public statement, but built into the policy list so that, for instance, in the human resources, the personnel policies, there's an EDI statement that goes beyond just being an equal opportunity employer to really acknowledge the issues related to implicit bias or the makeup of the staff in terms of making sure it reflects the demographics of the community that you serve. So fantastic question, work in progress, but we definitely can help you find those.
Okay, that was all the questions that we had so far for that part.
Ooh, you guys are taking it easy on me tonight. Maybe this is one of the benefits of doing this online. But I do want to say we want to make sure you get your questions answered, and maybe this format isn't ideal for you personally, but we're definitely going to make sure you have our email and phone number at the end of today, so you know where to get in contact with us if you have more questions. So our last section here, a little shorter than the other two, we're talking about board meetings, which I'm guessing even the person who's only been on the board for 6 weeks has probably been to a board meeting at this point. It might have been a little different than a normal board meeting in a normal year, given that it was held online. But a lot of the same tenets are going to apply whether you're in person or online, including how open meetings law applies to your experience as a public library board member. On pages 22 to 23 in your packet, there is detailed information on this. I just want to point that out so you don't get a hand cramp trying to write down everything you see on the screen or that I say right now. We'll definitely send you the slides from tonight so you have that to back up your handout packet. But what we wanted to make sure was very clear was that regardless of the type of library you are, so this means association libraries, municipal libraries, and both types of district libraries, all fall under open meetings law in New York State. So what does that actually mean? That means that the public has the right to attend your meetings. They have to be held in an accessible location. Right now, they've made an adjustment because of COVID to allow you to hold those meetings online, but you must publish how the public can attend and listen in, if not watch, what's going on at that board meeting, that the public has the right to watch how decisions are made about their library. It's their money helping to underwrite it, and they have the right to understand how it's being spent. They have the right to understand the dialogue behind policy decisions and how those are being influenced and how you handle controversial issues that might come up. For those of you who have been on the board for more than 6 months and remember the before times when we had meetings in person at our libraries, you might think to yourself, the public never came to our meetings. I didn't even know people knew we had meetings. There is a public announcement requirement under open meetings law. You have to publish or at least send your meeting dates to your newspaper of record, and you need to decide that newspaper of record annually. You have to prove that you sent it to them, but you do not have to pay for a legal notice. It should be posted in the library and on the library's website. So it's pretty transparent when library board meetings are. Any materials, documents that are going to be discussed at the board meeting need to be made publicly available. So more and more libraries are starting to post their board packets on the website so they meet that criteria of the law. But in public settings, you can also have copies available to hand out. But again, since our meetings are being held online for the most part right now, you'll want to think about getting board documentation onto the website so the public has free access to it as required by the Opens Meeting Law. Your minutes of the meeting, if you find yourself in the role of secretary of the board, you have to have a draft of the minutes done within 2 weeks of the meeting. So again, obviously wouldn't be an approved meeting minutes because that doesn't happen until the next board meeting, but a draft needs to be available should a member of the public ask for it. You might never have someone ask for it and you'll roll your eyes thinking that was a waste of time. But if someone ever did come and ask for it, you'd, I think, again, be seen as more transparent and accountable if you were following the law in this manner and had that draft done in that 2-week window. The law does allow for something called executive session. It allows you to, for a sensitive reason, but only for reasons defined by law, ask the public to leave the meeting, either leave that online meeting at this point or in normal times when you're in the building, ask them to leave the room for a private and confidential conversation. This might seem like an awesome idea to do all the time, but you're not allowed to under open meeting law. You can only do it for certain reasons. And you can't just do it as a one-off. You can't say, hey, on Tuesday night, we're having an executive session. You actually have to do it during one of your board meetings or during a special meeting you've announced to the public and open the meeting to the public. There needs to be a motion made to go into executive session. Someone has to second it. The board has to vote to go into executive session. And in that motion, the reason for going into executive session must be stated. So you can't just say, yep, well, I'd like to go into executive session. And someone's, oh, I agree. And the whole board says, yes, let's go. You have to say, we need to go into executive session for the purpose of discussing a real estate purchase, which is a legally allowable reason to use executive session. All trustees must stay in the room for that discussion. 99% of the time, you want your director in the room with you, unless the issue is the director, of course. You can invite your lawyer into an executive session. You could invite me into an executive session if you needed some advice on something. But you can only talk about that issue while the public's not in the room. If you make any decisions during executive session, then you have to take minutes during your executive session, which might seem counterintuitive because you're just keeping things confidential. So why would you have minutes of what you just talked about? So a good lesson for board presidents is how they manage executive sessions, making sure they manage them well and legally. And if they don't need to take a vote in the meeting, the executive session portion of the meeting, don't. Wait till you come out of executive session to take the vote, or come to consensus that doesn't require a vote in the span of the executive session. There's 8 reasons you can go into executive session, but the most common ones for libraries are listed here on the slide. If you're being sued or you're suing someone else, if you have a union, which is very rare in our system, only one library has a union, if you are purchasing property or selling property, and most frequently is the last one, is an employment issue, personnel issue, either from a disciplinary standpoint, the evaluation of the director, when you're hiring someone new. These can all perhaps be triggers for having an executive session. But I'll tell you something, if it's an uncomfortable conversation, that does not meet the test for going into executive session. If you're talking about money, a lot of trustees think, well, we're going to talk about salaries. We better go into executive session. Well, salaries are normally paid for with public money, which means the public has the right to understand how it's being spent. However, if you're having a conversation related to a disciplinary problem and the director is proposing docking someone's pay, absolutely, that would be a reason to go into executive session to, I think, protect that reputation of that particular person. So executive session outlined in your handouts, as well as referred to in the trustee handbook. Hopefully you don't have to use it that often. Just remember, every time you use executive session, it plants a seed of suspicion. Your staff and the public wonder, what are they doing in there? Why couldn't they talk about that issue in front of us? So you definitely want to respect that issue and use it appropriately and sparingly too, I would say. Now, the public has the right to attend your meeting, but they don't have the right to comment and talk at the meeting unless your board has procedures that allows for that. Keep in mind that the board meeting is for the board to do the business of the library. It's not an open grape session for the community, or if you've got an issue that they're not happy about and they want to come tell the board about it. You can create rules for public comment, which I highly recommend. I think it's way better to have a public comment period, even though you don't have to. I think it's a good faith gesture to show the public you certainly welcome them and want to hear from them. But there should be rules surrounding that so no one can dominate your meeting or just jump into conversations when you're debating an issue about policy and put their 2 cents in. They were not elected to the board or appointed to the board, and their voice does not have equal weight during a board meeting. So rules for those things, I think, can save you some trouble when you ever have a controversy. Maybe you never have a controversy. They're pretty rare in library land. But if you do, you'll be very grateful you have those public comment procedures in place. Now, best practices for for board meetings, you want to be getting your board packet about a week in advance so you actually have time to look it over and think things through. You want to read that packet before you get in the door to the board meeting. It's really hard to read the documents and participate in conversations at the same time. And there's absolutely nothing preventing you from asking questions in advance. If you have a question about a financial document or something in the director's report, feel free to ask those questions before the meeting. But of course, you can wait until the meeting to ask those questions too. And it is your job to ask questions. If you don't understand something, highly likely the rest of the public wouldn't understand it either. And so in the vein of being a transparent and accountable board, I think it's really important for us to take the financial documents, the board reports, the committee reports, the director reports very seriously. That is the I think meat and potatoes of those board meetings is understanding what you're reading and testing it to make sure it meets understanding for yourself as the board of trustees. We recommend that you do not introduce new business at the meeting. So meaning that you had a bright idea in the middle of a board meeting and say, I would love to talk about doing a community garden. Doesn't that sound like an awesome idea, guys? It totally is an awesome idea, but that isn't the exact right moment to bring it up. When you want to talk about stuff at board meeting, you need it to be on the agenda in advance so people have time to prepare for the conversation. Otherwise, it just is a circular conversation that doesn't really go anywhere, and it has to get on the agenda of the next meeting anyway. So having an idea, that's what you're there for, is to have ideas. Funnel them up to the board president, see if we're going to get them on the agenda, or maybe referred to a committee of the board, which would then ultimately have it discussed at the board meeting. Making good use of Robert's Rules of Order. If you're not familiar with Robert's Rules of Order, I suggest you Google Robert Rules of Order cheat sheet. And just get the basics of how to make a motion, how to second a motion, how things get voted, how you amend a motion. That really keeps business going at a good clip during those meetings and helps them be run professionally. And my last little tip for you here is to always behave as if a member of the press is in the room with you when you're having your board meeting, as if you could be the headline tomorrow morning. So, keeping socialization, social chit chat to a minimum during the business portion of your meeting, keeping maybe off-color comments to yourself or jokes that might be seen as inappropriate. Save those for before and after the meeting, that's cool. But during the business portion of the meeting, stick to the business, be professional. Again, always try to be transparent and accountable with the public. That's the kind of image we want our libraries projecting, and you, I think yourselves are happy to project as well, to be seen as a trustworthy trustee at your library. So Casey, I'm wondering if any questions came through on board meetings.
So I haven't seen any questions come through on board meetings, but people are welcome, of course, to put any questions that they have into the question box or the chat box, and we can answer those.
All right, in case anyone's still thinking, I'll just chat a little bit here and point out in your packet, you've got a list of acronyms that I mentioned. At the end, you've also got a list of on-demand webinars, basically pre-recorded webinars on some of the topics we've talked about tonight, both from Mid-Hudson and the State Library. If you want to take a deeper dive on something like the role of the treasurer or the role of the board president or community-based planning or the property tax cap, some kind of nitty-gritty stuff. Not only do we have live webinars coming up, but there's also those on-demand webinars that are available to you. Casey, anything else come through?
No, I'm not seeing anything in the question box or the chat box.
Okay. I'll just end here with a message of thanks to you. I think public libraries are uniquely American. The idea that anyone can walk through the doors and access any information in the world to improve the lives, their own life, the life of their children, to contribute to a better community. It's a really special institution that matters a great deal to a freely operating democracy. And so we just wanted to end by saying thank you so much for volunteering your time at your local public library, for taking the time to learn more about that responsibility here with us this evening. We hope you'll consider us a resource. We are absolutely delighted to help you. If you can't tell, we live for this stuff. We think libraries are awfully special, or we wouldn't have devoted our professional lives to them. So we just want to end tonight by saying thank you and to remind you, you truly are helping to make the world a better place. You are a bright spot during a very difficult time in our world these days. So thank you very much. Here's our contact information, and we hope, if nothing else, we've conveyed to you tonight that we're here to help if you have questions.